Welcome, everyone. I'm Mark Miller. I'm the global editor of Bloomberg Live, and thank you all for joining this session of the Year Ahead. I'm joined today by Michael Chui, who is partner at McKinsey and Company and the McKinsey Global Institute, to talk about a new report that McKinsey has just come out with, which is titled "The Economic State of Latinos in America, the American Dream Deferred." And just to note that McKinsey is, of course, a sponsor of today's event. So, Michael, thank you again for joining us. I was struck by a number of conclusions of this report, which is available online, and I'll give folks a directions on where they can find this report when we're finished here. I want to take you through, obviously you're one of the co-authors of the report, so you know these things, but I want to take the audience through a number of striking statistics, striking to me, that you find in this report. So just to set the stage for our conversation, Latinos make up 18.4% of the US population and 17.3% of the US labor force. That share is forecast to rise to more than 30% by 2060. Latino Americans make just 73 cents for every dollar earned by white Americans. Your research finds that Latinos are collectively underpaid by about $288 billion a year. Latino businesses could generate an additional $2.3 trillion in total revenue each year, and create 735,000 new businesses that would also create and support 6.6 million new jobs were we able to close this gap. And then in terms of intergenerational wealth, Latinos' annual flow of net wealth from one generation to the next could be as high as $380 billion than it is today if we were able to address the issues facing Latinos in America. So I think what was helpful in my reading of the report was to understand how you broke down into essentially four categories. And I was also struck by the sort of compounding nature of the problem. So Latino workers are paid less than their white counterparts, which then leads to less disposable income, less ability to generate wealth, et cetera, et cetera. And that is this circularity that one of your colleagues told me, if we do nothing, this problem will not be resolved in our lifetimes. So I'd like to start first with the first category that you study in this report, which is among workers. What you found is that wage and representation disparities across the US labor market result in a $288 billion annual income gap. What's behind that gap, Michael?
Well, Mark, thank you for your careful reading of the report. And first of all, I want to acknowledge the terrific contributions of many Latino colleagues who worked on this report. But when we take a look at this aggregate wage gap, it really falls in two large categories for the drivers of it. One is an overrepresentation in lower wage occupations and an underrepresentation in higher wage occupations. We can get into some of the reasons why that's true. But even within occupations, we find that Latino workers are paid less than their white counterparts, even within the same occupational categories. So we see both challenges there, as you said, with representation, as well as the wages that are paid within each occupation. And when we talk about, how can that change? Number one, we did study the pipelines into higher wage occupations, and there are some challenges there, that our education and training systems can try to address in order to, change the percentage, for example, of Latino lawyers, Latino doctors, and if we think about corporate America, how you can actually change not only the entering numbers of people going into various occupations, but also how advancement occurs throughout the system. Because again, if you look at middle management as well as executive management, we do see a decreasing funnel at this point and disproportionate rates for Latino workers.
So it seems to me there are two issues here. One is the wages that Latino workers are paid, particularly in these frontline positions, which we've all come to know are critical positions as the pandemic has helped us understand. And we also should point out that Latinos have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19, in part because they are in these frontline positions. So there's that problem. So is the one solution we need to raise wages for that group? And then there's the pipeline problem. How do you deal with both issues?
Yeah, I think you said it correctly. There are a disproportionate number of Latino workers who work in occupations which we described as essential during the pandemic, and they have been affected more than the white population, for instance, and white workers. And so, number one, can we make those jobs better? They are essential. We've declared them essential in our society. What would it mean to actually pay them as essential, but also other factors as well, whether it's benefits. Again, if you think about a pandemic and the effect that it's had on people's health, not having health care, not having sick days, those types of benefits, again, could improve for a lot of people who are actually in those occupations where Latino workers are disproportionately represented. At the same time, how can we create pathways, number one, for people who are in those lower wage occupations? We've done some analyses, for instance, to understand what are the skills that someone in one of those occupations might have, whether it's a construction job, whether it's an agricultural services job, again, whether it's, doing work in an urban area, whether it's, in a hotel or what have you. And we actually find overlaps in those skills that those people are exhibiting and those workers are exhibiting in those occupations that actually overlap with occupations that are higher wage. And so how can we actually create these pathways for people from lower wage occupations into higher wage occupations? And then, of course, again, how can we improve those pipelines? Take, for example, the pipelines to physicians. What we see is, a lower percentage of Latino students majoring in college in STEM professions and STEM majors. How can we actually make those majors more inclusive, more welcoming for Latino students? And how can we actually support their, number one, entry into college and then completion of college? And so there are a number of different factors, but again, it is partly around representation and then partly around the wages that are paid within occupation.
Right. The second category you look at in this report are business owners. And what's interesting, again, to me about this report is it shows how there has been progress and there's tremendous potential, actually, among the Latino population if we can then find ways to break through some of these barriers. So, for example, Latinos start more businesses per capita than any other racial or ethnic group in the United States, which is, to me, a fascinating statistic. But these Latino-owned businesses have lower sales, lower profits than comparable white-owned firms. And you identify the issue essentially as a lack of access to adequate capital. Many of these firms are founded by, using money from their families or high-interest credit cards. How do we break down that barrier? How can Latino businesses find more actual capital to build their businesses with?
Yeah, from my standpoint, that was one of the most remarkable findings that we discovered, which is the incredibly high rate of Latino entrepreneurship. As you said, almost double the next, largest ethnic or racial group in a per capita basis. Nearly half of 1% of the Latino population starts a new business every year. So it's a remarkable amount of entrepreneurship. That said, when we actually look at the numbers of Latino-owned companies that are in the economy, and as you said, the revenue per firm, it is below what you would expect with proportional representation. And so, unfortunately, we have a higher percentage of Latino-owned businesses leaving and exiting, and not necessarily because of an acquisition. And so, as we analyze, for example, capital flows and capital investments into Latino-owned businesses, you know, again, institutional capital was a much lower percentage than friends and family. And so trying to understand, and we can come back to this again, how we can improve financial inclusion, not only on the consumer side, but for this incredible set of Latino entrepreneurs is one of the real challenges for our, whether it's VC, whether it's private equity, whether it's traditional bank financing. There is a huge opportunity here. And if we actually enable additional capital to flow there, we would expect, as you mentioned before in the opening, many more Latino-owned businesses supporting millions, potentially 6 million jobs in the economy. And just, we can come back to this as well, and I presume we will, because we looked at these 4 different roles, these 2 different roles where, Latino people make money, so as a worker, as an entrepreneur, and then where they can invest that money as a saver or spend it as a consumer. Again, if you have, more Latino-owned businesses, more Latino workers, but other workers that are employed by those businesses, will have a more competitive economy. And as you said before, the percentage of Latinos in the workforce and in the population is just increasing in a very real sense. The future of American growth is Latino people.
So how can we have financial institutions be more intentional about the access to capital and working with Latino-owned businesses? Are there programs out there or projects that you've seen that can serve as models for the industry, financial industry?
There certainly are, and this is a wonderful thing about American business. If we focus on the opportunity, companies do run to it. I think to a certain extent, just a lack of understanding has occurred already. So even traditional bank financing, simply being able to understand, look, this is a consumer, an entrepreneurship market for which loans actually can be quite profitable, will bring financing. That said, of course, we do have institutional organizations around community finance, which are focused on underrepresented populations. Again, those will continue to do their work, and we've seen commitments to increased funding to those CDFIs, as they call them. Right. We're seeing that happen as well. And even on the tech side, whether it's I live in San Francisco, for instance, VCs generally the funding has been underrepresented to brown and black entrepreneurs. We're seeing an increased focus on understanding the importance of equity, but again, the value in terms of the potential business value of really unlocking these sets of Latino entrepreneurs.
Right. And I think one important takeaway is, as we've just been discussing, this isn't just about Latinos in America. This is about actually supporting the American economy. If you can unlock that value that you were just speaking of, then the economy as a whole will grow as well. So it's about helping the overall economy, not just the Latino participation in it. I want to get to the third category that you identify in the report, which is around consumers. Latino consumption has grown about 6% annually for the past 8 years, roughly double the pace of spending growth among non-Latino whites. Again, sort of fascinating statistic of what the potential is. But you also find that the combination of lower incomes and wealth and reduced access to goods and services creates what you call an unmet demand of about $660 billion each year. What do you mean by that unmet demand?
Well, first of all, we should recognize, as you said before in the open, that in fact these roles, right, we have these 4 different lenses. We all have different ways in which we think of ourselves are interlocked. And again, if we actually are able to increase the incomes of Latino workers, of course, that will improve, the amount of money they have to spend as consumers. And as you were saying, therefore, this virtuous cycle actually adds to the overall growth of the American economy. And again, this is, our firm, we've talked about sustainable, inclusive growth. Inclusivity actually increases growth. So that's number one. what did we find when we tried to examine the Latino consumer? As you said, Latino consumption, many folks who are in the consumer industries understand has been growing by leaps and bounds, and yet we still see even more potential. And so number one is, again, if we're able to solve the income gap, we'll see more consumption as well. But we also found two other factors. One is that access to consumer goods and services is more challenging for Latinos. For instance, consumer deserts around healthcare, and around housing, just simply not being able to have access to it. And then we also found Latino consumers were more dissatisfied with the products and services that they were receiving. So that's a consumer latent demand. And in fact, we're willing to pay more if in fact their products and services were better tailored to their needs. And so that is just an opportunity sitting on the table for consumer companies to try to address.
Right. One thing that I found digging into the data that I thought was also fascinating, and I think it's important to point out for our audience, is that Latinos obviously are not a monolithic group. We're talking about a large group of people from different countries who now reside in the United States, people who are born in the United States to different communities. So one, I believe I had this right, but correct me if I'm wrong, that Latinos of Cuban origin were the least satisfied, I believe, of their ability to meet their consumer needs. And you just mentioned one group that's willing to pay more, which I believe are Latinos of Mexican origin, right? So I thought that was really interesting, the difference between the groups within what we define or call Latinos.
Yeah, all Latino subgroups were willing to pay more for different types of products and services. But nevertheless, as you said, it is an incredibly important understanding, which many folks do understand, but not everyone does, which is that the Latino population is far from monolithic. And on all of those dimensions, whether it's as workers, as consumers, as entrepreneurs, as savers, there are significant differences, not only by subgroup, but also, Latina versus Latino, the gender dimension also makes a big difference, and where people live. And so again, it's important to understand, and certainly consumer marketers do, that these segments vary quite significantly.
Right. The fourth group that I wanted to talk about are what you define as the savers and investors. And this gets at the transfer of wealth between generations. So intergenerational disparities and the continuing barriers to wealth generation overall result in a $380 billion gap in the annual flow of net wealth compared to white Americans. This, I think, sort of gets at the sort of systemic issue that we're talking about here, which is if you're unable to build the wealth, then you can't transfer that wealth to the next generation that can then subsequently build on that. And so it seems to me that's one of the most important findings, which is this gap in intergenerational wealth. How can we fix that beyond the solutions to the other three issues we've just talked about?
Well, I do think the solutions to the other three issues, particularly on the worker side, is one of the most important ones. And again, if people make money, they're able to save more. And again, what we find, in terms of these things being interconnected, the Latinos consumers spend more of their income on essentials, and so constraining their ability to save. So again, working on the worker part, is probably one of the things that can most help on the wealth part. But another aspect here is just financial inclusion. Again, Latino savers are much less likely to be accessing, number one, even just banking, but then two, equities and other asset classes.
Stock market.
And so this is an opportunity for financial institutions to really reach out.
Right. The other point that I think that's important for people to understand is the amount of money that Latinos in America send to their relatives, either here in the United States or outside the country. So because of immediate needs, right? Their family members need that capital. And so that contributes to the lack of intergenerational wealth transfer overall, I would imagine. In our final seconds here, I wanted to ask you an audience question. With the administrator of the Small Business Administration coming up, this audience question is, what more do you think the government can do to help level the playing field? Is there a role for the government here?
Two things. One is data is incredibly important, and it is indeed lacking. And so I think that's one thing that the government can certainly do. And then secondly, government shapes all kinds of different policies, which have the opportunity, whether it's education policy, whether it's labor policy, and whether it's how can we actually support Latino entrepreneurs and business owners. There are a myriad different ways in which if you take this lens, how can we actually increase the economic participation of Latinos for the benefit of the American economy? There are, that lens can be taken across the entire policy landscape.
Right. Well, we've run out of time. Thank you, Michael, for participating in the year ahead. And for our viewers, at the end of the event, you'll be able to find the full report, this full McKinsey report, in our resource section on our website, bloomberglive.com. So I encourage you to go there after the program today. Thanks again.
Thank you, Mark.